Welcome back. Today's lecture is going to be on the build up to World War II and kind of, what the background is in the world that, led to the formation of, different groups of allies that were in contention with each other. So, the first thing that we have to talk about when we're talking about the background of, the situation in the world is the Depression. The Depression has, just absolutely devastated most of the world. I think here in America, we recognize, it was one of the worst economic times in American history. But as bad as it is for us, it is, worse all around the world. And so, America's economy really thrived during World War One. We had problems during the 1920s that I think people kind of ignored, but for the most part, the foundation of our economy is good. We didn't lose an entire generation of men during World War One, like a lot of the European powers did. And so when the economy tanks in the United States, and we see unemployment somewhere between 25 and 33% in the United States. It's even worse in Europe because the underlying economic conditions in Europe were significantly worse than the United States, right? They've had a significant portion of their workforce either killed or disabled because of World War One. There were supply chain disruptions that there just weren't in the United States. They didn't make as much money off of World War One as the United States does. As a matter of fact, most of those countries lose money during World War One, and so when the Depression hits, it really hits everywhere, and Europe is in some real serious problems. And so what you see is because the problems, the economic problems, are so serious in Europe, you start to see people, turning to strong men, dictators to try and fix problems. So the economic conditions around the world are bad. We see a return to high tariffs around the world. That is primarily America's fault. The United States wanted to isolate itself economically after World War One, mostly because we believe that the reason we got involved in World War One to begin with was because of our trade relationships with European countries, and we want to make sure that we don't slide into war again because we want our trading partners to do well. And so these high tariffs come up. When the United States lifts tariffs, which are taxes on imports, makes European goods more expensive, which damages the European economy. The European countries put tariffs on American products, which means Europeans are buying less of our stuff. And so, you start to see worldwide people buying less things from foreign countries, which, by the way, is the exact opposite of the thing you want to have happen during the Great Depression. It would benefit everybody if we were trading more together. Everybody's economy does a little bit better. We buy their goods, which means their people are employed to make those goods, which means their people have more money, which means they buy more of our goods, which means that our workers stay employed, which means they buy more of European goods, and so it's this building cycle. But when you see the tariffs put in place, all of a sudden now everybody goes on to lockdown. The economy is actually going to get worse, and lead people to become pretty desperate. The other thing that's bad about tariffs is anytime you see a decrease in world trade, you see an increase in violence. I mean, I think the number one thing that has limited warfare, in the 21st century, has been the expansion of free trade. Now, free trade has problems, but at the end of the day, free trade ends wars. And so, these high tariffs are going to be a bad situation for the 20th century, which turns out to be the most violent century in the history of humankind. And so, these tariffs decrease trade, and as they decrease trade, the economies get worse, and as the economy gets worse, people start to get more and more desperate. Germany is going to be hurt worse than all the other countries. They're going to have it, terribly bad in Germany, and that has to do with for a number of reasons. One, they lost significant portions of their workforce during World War One. Two, they have to pay war reparations for World War One. The Treaty of Versailles just crushed Germany, right? They had to accept war guilt, so they had to say that all of World War One was their fault, which clearly it wasn't, and they have to pay for the cost of the war. So they owe Great Britain and France just an obscene amount of money that they're not able to pay back. When they can't pay that money back, France and Belgium will invade the resource-rich Ruhr Valley and just start to take raw materials out of Germany. So Germany's just not in a position to help themselves economically, and that's done on purpose. France, Great Britain, Belgium, but France and Great Britain primarily want to hurt Germany. They want Germany to, be so economically devastated that they're not capable of making war again. The problem with that is the more you crush somebody, the more desperate they become. And, when you make people desperate enough, you find out really quickly how violent they can become. And that's kind of what happens. It's an oversimplification, but it's kind of what happens with Germany. And so what we see in times of crisis and in times of absolute economic devastation, people start to turn to their government for help, and an argument starts to get made in Europe that this experiment of modern democracy, and democracy at this point is historically relatively new. These leaders are going to start to make arguments that the experiment of modern democracy has failed. That the idea behind democracy, working to some sort of consensus and compromise, it just takes time. It waters things down. It doesn't react quick enough and swift enough in crises. And so what we see is a series of dictators that are going to rise up all across Europe that are going to say, hey, look, that's great. And freedom is awesome. But at the end of the day, wouldn't you rather feed your family? And, that's going to be really appealing to a lot of people. That's why you see, at first Mussolini in Italy, then Hitler in Germany, Franco in Spain, and even, Hirohito in Japan's been around for a long time. So I don't think we can include him, but in Europe, you see a rise of dictators because people at the end of the day, they love their freedom, but they would rather have food on their table. And, that's just, a hierarchy of needs, the freedom and free speech and the ability to vote and all that great stuff. It is great, but it's not as important as staying alive. And so these dictators will essentially say, if you want me to fix these extreme problems, I can do that, but to be able to do that, you have to lose some of your freedom. And that's going to be an appealing argument to a lot of rational people in the middle class. And these guys won't be able to rise to power without the support of what has been an educated and typically rational middle class. So what's the situation for Great Britain, France, and the United States? Well, one, we're going to see a whole bunch of countries that are going to be kind of resentful towards these three powers. The historic powers of Great Britain and France. There's always been some jealousy there. The United States has pretty much firmly attached itself to Great Britain at this point, and so there's historic resentments there by some of these other world powers that feel like they're maybe second tier or third tier powers, feel like they've been taken advantage of. And then with the Treaty of Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles is so punitive, particularly to Germany, but it it's going to scare a lot of other nations as well. It's really clear that the Treaty of Versailles is designed to maintain power for Great Britain and France. And there's going to be a series of other institutions and treaties that are designed to keep Great Britain and France in power and keep the status quo. And so, Germany is going to be extremely resentful of the Treaty of Versailles and how punitive it has been. But there's other countries too. Italy, the Soviet Union, Japan. A lot of them are going to be looking at what Great Britain and France are doing and are going to feel like that all the things that they're doing are designed to keep the status quo. And if you're a rising power, you're really not going to like that. Great Britain, France, and the United States really are not recognizing how volatile the world is. They don't recognize the animosities that some of these countries are feeling, like Japan and Italy. Italy ultimately was on the Allied side during World War I, and so you would suspect that they would, be a supporter of Great Britain and France, and Great Britain and France just kind of don't really see the seething and the like kind of anger that some of these second tier world powers are feeling. They pretty much think they're safe. They think that their economies and militaries are top tier. The problem with that is that although they had world class militaries in 1910, technology has just off the charts skyrocketed. And so these former world powers in Great Britain and France, they are really interested in the status quo. They're not embracing new technology. They feel like, hey, look, we've been on top doing what we've done, so we're just going to continue to do that. Whereas, nations like Germany and Japan recognize that they don't have the same advantages that Great Britain and France do, and that if they want to become world powers, they're going to have to technologically innovate. They're going to have to embrace new technologies and new strategies, and that's what will give them the advantage. And so, the Great Britain and France are really lulled into this sense of security, like, hey, we're the big dogs, and nobody's going to really mess with us, and which will end up being a very big mistake. Right. There are major issues going on as well that are still causing tension within Europe. One is the Depression. We've talked about that already. The second is the failure to collect war debts and to actually have Germany pay their war debts. So this issue of the collecting the war debts is really important to Great Britain and France. They want to suck Germany dry for a number of reasons. One, because they want to use that money to get their economies going. They owe America money as well, and so there's pressure on them to pay the United States. So they want to collect from Germany so they can pass that money on to the United States to get rid of their war debt. Well, Germany's economy is so bad that they can't afford to pay those debts. Germany later will go on to printing money, which will cause hyperinflation, and then that money's not worth anything. And then what do you do then? Well, I don't want your money because it's not worth anything, so I'll just go ahead and take your resources, which will further devastate their economy. And so there's that issue as well. That is happening all across the world. And the ultimate, I shouldn't say the ultimate solution, the solution that they come to will ultimately be the Dawes Plan. The Dawes Plan we'll discuss a little bit later, but Dawes Plan is really just a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. It's not going to do much. It's not a permanent fix. And when the Dawes Plan falls apart, this issue becomes a real major issue that's going to cause a lot of resentment, and it's going to put Germany in a situation that is really devastating to the German people, which will push the German people into electing a guy like Hitler. And we always have to remember Hitler didn't take over in a coup. That's not what happened. An educated and very liberal and modern democracy voted him into power, and that's how desperate they were, that they elected somebody who very clearly had written a book about how he was going to set up a dictatorship by getting voted into office. And so the war debt situation is very, very important to how Hitler gets into power. So what are some of the failures that have been happening? So after World War One, really, there was this idea that World War One was the war to end all wars, and they want to set up these institutions and things to keep the world from going to war again. Well, most of those end up being a failure. The first failure is clearly the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles is way too punitive, meaning that it's way too punishing of Germany. It makes Germany declare war guilt, which, you think that maybe that's not a huge issue, but it's a pride issue. The alliance system that was in place before World War One, and global imperialism, and the rise of militarism and nationalism. Every country believed they were superior to the other country. Every country involved in World War One had those things going on. They all wanted to go to war. They thought it would be quick, and so it really wasn't any one country's fault. Now, I think maybe we can lay a little bit more blame on Germany than other countries, but even that might be a stretch. And so to make them take war guilt is, kind of adding insult to injury. And, then on top of the war guilt, their military, because of the Treaty of Versailles, is limited to only 100,000 people. And so that's essentially just a police force. They're disarmed. So there's all kinds of restrictions on what kind of weapons that their military can own. And so, Germany goes from being a world power to a third-rate power that is, very, very vulnerable. They have to pay war reparations that they can't afford to pay, which will completely devastate their economy. It will wreck their money supply. They're going to print money, like I said before, to the point that their money essentially becomes worthless. It's cheaper to burn money in Germany at this time than it is to burn firewood. That's how crazy the inflation gets. And so, when you essentially destroy their economy to the point that it becomes a barter and trade economy, and people aren't spending money anymore. They're like, I'll trade you, 5 chickens for 1 goat. People get to become pretty desperate, and which will ultimately lead to dictators, and which will ultimately lead to war. And so, the Treaty of Versailles is an excruciating failure. The League of Nations also ends up being a failure as well. The League of Nations is the precursor to what we have today, the UN. The idea is you get all the nations together so they can talk out their problems. And the real problem with the League of Nations ends up being that it has no teeth. There's no enforcement mechanism. At the end of the day, laws work because there's an enforcement mechanism for those laws, right? If you break a law, a man with a gun shows up and essentially takes you to the through the justice system and through due process to punish you. But if the man with the gun doesn't show up, right, there's no real reason to obey those laws, and that's just unfortunately the way that it is. And so the League of Nations is able to kind of set rules and tell nations how to behave and how we're supposed to get along, and we're there to talk out their problems, but they have no way to really levy any kind of fines. They have no way to send in forces to stop countries from being aggressive. And so there's nothing they can really do to make people, or I should say in this case countries, behave. The other big problem is the United States doesn't join. We're at this point, we are we're probably not the number one military in the world. As a matter of fact, we are not the number one military in the world at the beginning of World War II. By the end, we will be. We could be arguably say that we are the number one economy in the world. We certainly are. Halfway through World War II, the biggest economy in the world, and so when the biggest kid on the block doesn't join the club doesn't really, mean it much. And so the League of Nations, which is designed to stop all this effort, to stop, future wars, is not going to work. As a matter of fact, Hitler later will use the League of Nations to kind of, justify the building of his army and some of his aggressiveness. He's going to make the claim, to the world that the League of Nations is not there to stop wars or to create peace, but the League of Nations is just there to enshrine Great Britain and France as as world powers and to keep everybody else down. So the League of Nations will ultimately fail. The Dawes Plan will fail as well. The Dawes Plan is designed to try and fix the problem of the payment of war debts, right? And so you kind of have a situation where Great Britain and France owe America money from war materials from World War I. Germany owes Great Britain and France money because they've got to pay war reparations, and for the cost of the war. And so Germany doesn't have any money. And so they can't pay back Great Britain and France. Well, Great Britain and France's economy is in no shape to pay back what they owe America. And so, but America does have money following World War I, right? We made money during World War I. And so the idea behind the Dawes Plan is we kind of set up a triangle, right? And so we've got America at the top who has money, right? Germany over here who doesn't have money, Great Britain and France that doesn't have money. And what America does is it gives Germany loans. Those loans then go from Germany. Germany uses those loans to pay back Great Britain and France. Great Britain and France then get that money and they use it to pay back America, right? And so that plan is, like I said before, it's a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, right? It's not sustainable. One, it's not going to be enough money. America's not going to give Germany enough money to pay all those loans back. And the idea is we're loaning Germany the money. They're paying off Great Britain and France. And then America, because they're economically in a better situation, they can kind of wait and let Germany's economy recover before we collect on the loans that we gave them. And so for a little while, it works, and it's going to keep the wolves at bay. But then eventually, something happens, and the money dries up. That something is the Great Depression. Once the Great Depression happens, there's just too many Americans that say, why are we giving Germany money? We need that money here at home in the United States. And so all of a sudden, that money dries up. When that money dries up, all of a sudden, Germany's not getting money. They can't pay back Great Britain and France. So Great Britain and France are going to just take the resources from Germany, and that is going to make the situation way worse. Germany can't stop Great Britain, France, and Belgium from taking those resources because the Treaty of Versailles limited their military to 100,000 people. Essentially, anybody can take whatever they want from Germany, and Germany doesn't have the ability to stop them, right? So the Dawes Plan ends up being a failure. And then we also see the Washington Naval Conference and the failure of the Washington Naval Conference. And so I have to talk about the Washington Naval Conference for a minute. The idea behind the Washington Naval Conference is that if you want to limit future wars and worldwide wars, what you really need to limit is navies, right? If you don't have gigantic navies, you really can't fight a war on a global scale. You have to be able to ship troops and equipment all across the world to be able to fight these gigantic wars. And so the idea behind the Washington Naval Conference seems to be a relatively noble one. But the problem is Nobody's going to give up all of their navies. You're never going to get countries to do that because it will leave them defenseless. And so what the Washington Naval Conference does is it creates a tiered system. And so it says, look, everybody already has these navies. We're just going to freeze everybody at the level that they're at now. And so they really group them into 3 tiers. But to simplify it, it's just freeze your navies. You're not allowed to build a navy any larger than the countries that are ahead of you. And so that lists the countries like in order, with the biggest navies on top and the weakest navies on bottom. And so once you're listed in those tiers, you're not allowed to build your navy, right, bigger than the country ahead of you. And so it just freezes everything where it's at. Now, that is a very serious oversimplification of the Washington Naval Conference. But the idea is if you freeze it where it's at, we don't get this gigantic arms race that increases the likelihood of war. And so from the perspective of America, Great Britain, and France, seems great, right? We don't have to worry about these aggressive nations, building up these threatening militaries. But if you're particularly Germany and very seriously Japan, you've got a problem with this, right? Because it essentially relegates you to a 2nd tier or 3rd tier power forever. Japan is going to have real problems with this, right? Japan is just recently industrializing, and it's doing it at a scale that is just unheard of, right? I mean, they are industrializing quicker than any other nation has ever industrialized. And to be an industrial power, you have to have resources. Well, Japan is an island. It's a series of islands, but it's an island. And they don't have enough resources to keep up with their industrial capacity. And so they have to get those resources from other countries. And the only really way to do that is through imperialism. And from their perspective, it's like all the people that are major world powers today were imperial powers or are still imperial powers. And so if it's good enough for you, it's good enough for me. But the Washington Naval Conference essentially says to Japan, you can no longer build a gigantic military. And a great big navy, which means that will destroy Japan's industrial capabilities. And so the Washington Naval Conference really becomes a shot at Japan, and it's going to push Japan closer to other countries that also feel like they've been mistreated. For example, Germany, who is being limited by the Treaty of Versailles. And so you really start to see here a situation in which these 2nd tier world powers, or these abused, these countries that feel like they're abused, start to look at Great Britain and France and say, you're the enemy. You're the one holding us back. You're the one that's punishing Germany through the Treaty of Versailles. You're the one pushing the League of Nations, which is saying that all these other countries can't expand, i.e. me, right? You're the one that is limiting the size of navies. And so if these other countries that feel that way want to grow, they're really starting to view Great Britain, France, and kind of by proxy, the United States as an impediment to that growth. The next big failure and the last failure that we're going to talk about today, and the thing that we're going to wrap up on, is the failure of the Kellogg-Briand Pact. The Kellogg-Briand Pact is it's dumb. It's just kind of dumb. And so the Kellogg-Briand Pact is an international agreement to outlaw war. So if war is bad, then you know what we should do? We should just make it illegal. Well, there's a problem with the logistics there, right? We had talked about earlier in this lecture, why do laws work? Well, laws work because there's enforcement to those laws. So if we're going to outlaw war, right? And we are going to attempt to internationally outlaw war. The question then becomes, what's the enforcement mechanism? That's right, folks. The enforcement mechanism is war, right? I mean, it's just it's a ridiculous concept. And the people who are actually signing on to this understand that. Right, the Kellogg-Briand Pact is really not about outlawing war. It's about sending a united signal to the world that war is bad and we shouldn't do it this way anymore. But anytime, I think there's all kinds of parents out there that will tell you that anytime, you set a rule that you don't intend to enforce, you just lose your authority. And so that's what's going to happen here. These Western powers that are pushing the Kellogg-Briand Pact are pushing something that's not enforceable. And anytime you push something that's not enforceable, you're going to lose authority. And that's what happens with the Kellogg-Briand Pact. It's just, it's the second that you don't enforce it is the second that these dictators that are rising up in Europe are going to start to think that maybe the old powers don't have the stomach for another war, and Hitler's going to see through this right away. He's going to recognize that the West is tired and the West is weak, and so these old powers just aren't willing to do what's necessary to maintain their status at the top. And that will invite challenge from these dictators. All right. So that is part one of the prelude to World War II. Thank you very much for your time, and I will see you again shortly.